call them Christians. They're messianists. Now, why is that? If you would have got 40 days after the ascension, and you would have said to either Peter or John, tell us about your Christian beliefs, they would have scratched their heads going, what do you mean? They're a sect within Judaism, okay? That's why they wouldn't think of themselves as being distinctive or something other than Jewish. Yes, they believe Jesus is the Messiah. They believe they were now living in the Messianic age, but they didn't reject Judaism. They still worshiped in the temple. They still kept the Sabbath. They still observed Jewish dietary laws. They practiced circumcision. They avoided excessive contact with the Gentiles. So if you would have asked them, who is God? God is the God of Israel. Yes, God is the one true God. There aren't any other gods, but God is especially the God of Israel. But here's where they would have gone a little further. That God is now working salvation through the death, the resurrection, and the coming of his Son. So they're a Jewish sect, but they have distinctive beliefs about Jesus. Now, during the first 5 years after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, according to Acts, this messianic community grew and spread quickly. According to the report in Acts chapter 2, they started that day. And by the way, Pentecost is a Jewish holiday in its origin that comes 50 days after Passover. According to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Passover began that Thursday night at the Last Supper. In other words, according to the Bible, Pentecost didn't happen on a Sunday. Pentecost happened on a Friday. We have changed it to 50 days after Easter, but the original Pentecost would have been on Friday. So the day started, that Friday started, according to Acts, about 120 believers total. And by the end of the day, over 3,000 became believers. So it grew, but still it remained a Jewish sect. So who is God? God is the God of Israel. Now, some of the leaders of this messianic sect soon came into conflict. They came into conflict with the temple leadership. They came into conflict with the very leaders that had conspired against Jesus. They conspired against Jesus because of the disruptions he caused with regard to temple. And now you have Peter and John. They're coming into conflict. They are seeing them as disruptive forces. So there were some persecutions against the community by Jewish authorities linked to the temple. They regarded Jesus as a Jewish heretic, and they come to regard his followers as Jewish heretics. And within a few years, as things emerged, Saul becomes the leading persecutor. Saul is the leading persecutor because he sees Jesus as having been condemned by God's own law. And as a Pharisee, Saul was completely devoted to obedience to Torah, obedience to God's law. And he feels God condemned Jesus. The passage there in Deuteronomy 21:23. Cursed be the one who hangs upon a tree. And Saul came to interpret that to me that through crucifixion, God condemned Jesus. And so Saul becomes the leading persecutor of his followers. And then somewhere within those first 5-7 years, there was a radical shift in understanding God. Suddenly, they came to realize God is also the God of the Gentile. Now, those of you that were in church at 8:45, and those of you that are going at 11 o'clock, in the passage from Romans, Paul, of course, started out as Saul. Paul writes, God is the God of Greeks and Jews. There is this radical shift that, yes, God is God of Israel, but God is not the exclusive God. God is actually an inclusive God. So it's this evolution of understanding who is God. And so you have, according to Acts chapter 10, Peter is given a divine vision that not only are all foods clean, which goes against the Torah, all people can be clean. God is not the exclusive God of Israel. God is the inclusive God of all humanity. And so in the Acts 10 story, Peter's given that vision. And then he goes to Cornelius' house. Cornelius is a Roman. Cornelius is a Gentile. And because and through the radical vision, Peter realizes God's God of all. And so by the end of the story in Acts chapter 10, Cornelius and his entire household are baptized and receive the Holy Spirit. And at the same time, you've got God's revelation to and God calling Saul. Saul is to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, this proves God has a sense of humor. If you're going to send someone to be your lead missionary to non-Jews, who does God choose? The most orthodox Jew of them all. God's got a sense of humor. So it's not really, and you'll look it up in your Bible and they'll give it the heading, Acts chapter 9 will be the conversion of Saul. It's not a conversion as such. The day before the Damascus Road experience, Saul worshiped the God of Israel. The day after the Damascus Road experience, Saul worshiped the God of Israel. Not so much conversion as a call. Saul, i.e., Paul, came to understand who is God. God is the God of all. God is the God of both Gentiles and Jews. So therefore, he understands himself as being called to bring the gospel to Gentiles. But while Peter's having this vision, he's not in Jerusalem. He's over in Joppa, along the Mediterranean. Paul is being called on the road to Damascus. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, there is backlash. Backlash from what is called in the New Testament the circumcision party. Backlash by those messianists who still want to hold on to all aspects of the Torah, of the law. A chief identity marker under the law is circumcision. And so, Peter, what are you doing over there with the Gentiles? You're not supposed to be there because God is the God of Israel, exclusive. Saul goes back to Jerusalem, believing in Jesus. He left Jerusalem to arrest people who believed in Jesus. Now he comes back to Jerusalem preaching Jesus. He is sunset, set among the messianists. They can't believe this. No, you're our persecutor. So he is suspect and he has to leave Jerusalem. In the meantime, the leader of the community is no longer Peter. The leader of the community is James, and not James, son of Zebedee. James, Jesus' little brother. Whoa, that's some credentials. I mean, if you're Jesus' younger brother, you got a lot of status, you got a lot of credit. So by the year 50, James, Jesus' younger brother, is the leader in the Jerusalem church. And that leads to the first major controversy within Christianity. Again, who is God? So Jewish Christians, the Messianists, especially in Jerusalem, are questioning the validity and the terms of an outreach mission to Gentiles. It really is now James versus Paul. And that's where, when you read the book of Acts, by Acts chapter 12, Peter is no longer a central character. Peter in Acts puts in a cameo appearance in Acts 15, but from Acts 13 to Acts 28, Peter's nowhere to be seen. It's now James, leader of the Messianic Jewish community in Jerusalem, and Paul. Paul's apostolic mission to Gentiles was spreading throughout Asia Minor, was spreading into Europe. And the key message of Paul's apostolic mission, through faith in Christ, one comes into a right relationship with God, not through the law. His Jewish Christian opponents claim that Gentiles must adapt or adopt certain Jewish laws, circumcision, dietary laws, to remain in a right relationship with God. So they're willing to have Gentiles become members of God's chosen people, but requirements haven't changed. Circumcision, certain dietary laws. And so they are starting to undercut Paul's mission because they think Paul has changed the rules. They still see God as the God of Israel, primarily. Paul is now seeing God as the God of both Jews and Gentiles, and therefore Gentiles and Jews are brought into a right relationship with God through faith, not through the law. So either in the year 49 or 50, there was this major conference in Jerusalem. Paul arrives to present his God-given, law-free Gentile mission. So Paul comes, says, look, I'm just doing what God has told me to do, okay? By the end of the conference, Paul concludes he's reached an agreement with James, and James follows. From Paul's own perspective, and this goes right to Galatians chapter 2. From Paul's own perspective, here's what the agreement entailed. He'll continue a law-free mission to the Gentiles. Peter will spearhead an outreach mission to the Jews. Okay, so they got an agreement. Part of the agreement, though, is also Paul's Gentile churches will take a major collection, the poor Christians in Jerusalem. And of course, those poor Christians in Jerusalem would have still been Torah abiding Jews. So Paul leaves. He thinks, okay, we got an agreement. No problem. It's like, have you ever been at a meeting where when you leave, the meeting was to solve some kind of controversy, and you get done with the meeting, you shake hands, and people, you all think, okay, we got an agreement. And then 2 months later, it all hits the fan. That's not what we agreed to. Yes, it is. No, it is not. Let's check the minutes. Well, the minutes aren't exactly clear, and the controversy continues. That is what's happening after the Jerusalem conference. Some followers of James still regard Paul as a dangerous loose cannon, and they continue to undercut his ministry to the Gentiles. So you have followers from James going Paul's churches. Paul's churches are predominantly, if not overwhelmingly, Gentile. And they're saying, wait a second. Paul didn't give you the whole news. You still have to follow some basics of Torah. So Paul's letter to the Galatians and also to the Philippians include his attacks against Jewish Christians from James, especially Galatians. That is aimed to the Galatian Gentiles, but the target is also those followers of James who are undercutting Paul's ministry. Next week, our lesson is going to be from Philippians chapter 3. In fact, I'm even going to preach on that. When Paul says, their God, the enemy, their God is their belly. He's attacking those who are attacking his followers, saying, you got to keep kosher. Then he says, this will be the lesson next week, their glory is in their shame. And you might wonder, what the heck is that? He's talking about circumcised penis. Okay? That his enemies are glorying in circumcision. So when you hear that next week in church, you go, I know what he's talking about. Nevertheless, this is what's so interesting. Paul feels that James' followers have broken the agreement, have broken what they agreed to in Jerusalem. And you read Galatians, you read Philippians, he's tipped. Yet, he continues to push his Gentile churches to give to the collection for the poor in Jerusalem. Holy moly. You see, this is a concept from the first century that's really relevant in the 21st century. No matter how you get ticked off, you don't stop giving your money. Oh, how many congregations? We don't like the synod. What do we do? What's the first thing we do if we don't like the synod? Cut mission support. Individual Christians. Those pastors. I can't. What's the first thing I do? Withhold money. Paul refuses to do that, especially Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, you set that money aside every Sunday, set it aside. In fact, I don't, do our envelopes even have that verse on it? Sometimes church envelopes will have Paul's verse about setting aside money the first of every week. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. It's a lesson in stewardship. It's a lesson in money. So amazing thing, Paul's believing that James and his followers wealth on the deal, but he won't. And so he pushes for that collection. And then he's got a parting of ways. Paul takes the collection from his Gentile churches. He takes it and delivers it personally to Jerusalem. But he's rejected. The more radical Jews in Jerusalem regard Paul as apostate and conspire against him. Now, might want to ask, are those Jews also messianists, or don't they believe in Jesus? It's probably yes. Jerusalem is becoming much more radical. It's going to be a flashpoint in history. For Paul's own protection, he's arrested. He's arrested by the Romans. He appeals to Caesar because he's a Roman citizen, according to Acts. And so he's eventually taken to Rome to stand trial. But the whole atmosphere in Jerusalem is getting really, really heated. More and more radical Jews are in control. So much so that in the year 62, James, this is Jesus' little brother, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, is assassinated. He's assassinated by radical Jews who consider him an apostate. My biblical hero is Paul, okay? Always has been, from at least going back to even always in grade school. Paul has always been my hero. So much so that my dissertation is on Paul's theology of baptism. Okay. So I spent 2 years with Paul. During the time of my dissertation, my oldest son was born. My oldest son, the dissertation baby, is named Paul Luther Carls. But I appreciate the position of James. I mean, here it's kind of hard to live up to your older brother when he's the son of God. But James is leading a Christian community in Jerusalem. On the one hand, he thinks Paul's gone way too far. On the other hand, what's your mission field? Who are you going to evangelize? Other Jews in Jerusalem. And James gets caught because Jerusalem is becoming more and more radical. And so James is assassinated by the zealous Jews. Now, the whole radicality in Jerusalem blows in the year 60. Up to this time, in the temple worship, sacrifices and offerings would be made on behalf of the emperor, on behalf of Caesar. They're not offerings and sacrifices to Caesar, but on behalf. Why? Because the Romans are in the year 66, more and more radical Jews are in control. And you know what they stopped doing? Offering sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. And boom, the rebellion has started. You got the Roman Empire from the Arabian Desert to England. And this tiny little group of Jews rebel against Rome. It's insane, but they do. That's how radicalized Judaism became. So from 66 to 70 was the Jewish rebellion against. And at first, it was successful. At first, they hit the Romans' butt. But the Romans aren't going to let anybody rebel against them. And so eventually, the Romans, 3 legions arrive under Vespasian. They put the rebellion down by the year 70. And then the temple was destroyed in August of the year 70. The Romans destroyed the temple. So in 66, the Jews rebel against the Romans. The near leaderless Christians, James is gone, Peter's not around, Paul's not welcome. The leaderless Christians flee. They get out of Jerusalem before the Romans get there. They go across the Jordan River into what is modern day Jordan. But their relationship with other Christian communities is largely severed. And so eventually, the Jerusalem Christians fade away. They fade into history. At the same time, we now have the first round of imperial persecutions. Okay, the first persecutions were by temple leaders against Jesus' earliest followers in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem, up to Damascus. Now we're having the first round of imperial persecutions. On the one hand, there is no systematic empire-wide persecution in the first century. Okay, so there are no edicts, all Christians, their religion is outlawed. There wasn't that in the first century. On the other hand, there are pockets of significant imperial persecution. In 64, 2/3 of Rome burns. It is not clear from history, did Nero start it or not? Not clear. Some historians, going back to Roman historians, want to blame Nero for the fire. It just so happened that Nero wanted to build this huge palace complex, complete with a lake in downtown Rome. But you know what was in downtown Rome? Downtown Rome. After the fire, that section of Rome was gone. And so Nero did get to build his palace complex, including a lake. But people were starting to talk. They were blaming Nero. Some were blaming him for the fire. Some were blaming him for not getting the fire out in time. And so Nero has to find the culprits. And he scapegoats this little tiny sect called Christians. So to avoid blame for the fire, Nero persecutes Christians because they started the fire. And most likely, both Paul and Peter are executed during this persecution. Okay. Near the end of the first century, Emperor Domitian and his underlings instigate some local persecutions, both in Rome and in Asia Minor. And I say Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. So near the end of the first century, there are persecutions of Christians in certain spots. The book of Revelation is written partly in response to these persecutions. And so in the book of Revelation, the Roman Empire is portrayed as the whore of Babylon. Then in the year 107, you've got this dude named Ignatius. Ignatius was the bishop in Antioch. Antioch is in modern day Syria. He's condemned to death, but he appeals to Caesar. So he has to be taken to Rome. And when he's taken to Rome, he is killed by wild beasts in the arena. It's part of an imperial military celebration. What's interesting about Ignatius, he actually accepts his martyrdom. In fact, on the way to Rome, he's worried that the Christians in Rome are going to get him off. He doesn't want that. He's in his 70s. He wants to accept martyrdom as a sacrifice akin to that of Christ. So, the beginning of the second century, beginning of the hundreds, we start to see the Romans are trying to figure out who are these Christians and what the heck we have to do with them. Where that really gets displayed is there's a correspondence between Governor Pliny and Emperor Trajan. This is Pliny the Younger. There are two Plinies. Pliny the Older lived off of the coast of Italy. And one day, he sees there's this volcano exploding over there. It's Mount Vesuvius. And so Pliny the Elder says, we got to go investigate that. Pliny the Younger, his nephew, says, hey, I think I'll stay here. So Pliny the Elder sails over to investigate the volcano, and he goes to a city called Pompeii. Not a good move. So he's killed in the volcanic eruption. His nephew not only sees the eruption, not only writes about it, but then 30 years later, he's the governor in a Roman province in northern Turkey. And so he writes, the emperor, he writes saying he's not quite sure what to do with the men and the women and even older children who are denounced by their neighbors as Christian. By this time, now that Christians are starting to show up on the radar screen of the Roman Empire, Christians are thought to be atheists. Think of that. Christians were atheists. Why? They denied the existence of the Roman gods. So you have people denouncing these women and men and some older children. They're not worshiping the Roman gods. And so Pliny goes, what do I do? And Pliny says, well, I'm letting accused Christians get off. All they have to do is pray to Roman gods. All they have to do is burn incense as a sign of worship before the emperor's image, and then curse Christ. Okay? You don't want to be persecuted. This is all you have to do. And he says those accused Christians who refuse to renounce their faith are offered 3 opportunities to recant under threat of death. Those who refuse to recant are executed, unless they're Roman citizens, in which case, send them to Rome for trial like Paul and Ignatius. So this is what Pliny is writing, saying, this is what I'm doing. Is this okay? The emperor writes back. He replies, there's no imperial rule that says go seek out Christians. Don't go hunting them down, all right? But to those who are denounced, punish them if they refuse to recant. So as the church and its theology is evolving, so is its relationship with the Roman Empire. So Christianity by the year 100, there's no universal concept of one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, as is later confessed in the Nicene Creed. In the year 100, they're just not thinking in terms of the church. Instead, there are pockets of churches across the major areas of the Roman Empire. So the major pockets, one is there in Antioch, northeast or northwest Syria. That was a church very early on, so it's a very influential church. That's where Ignatius was bishop. Another pocket of Christianity is in modern day Western Turkey, the province of Asia. Those are the churches of Revelation. So the seven churches to whom John the seer writes in Revelation are all in the province of Asia. Another pocket of Christianity is in Greece. Those churches that were founded a generation before by Paul. Also in the East, Alexandria. We don't know how the church started in Alexandria. Acts says nothing about it, but Christian community gets very strong in Alexandria. Further west, another pocket of Christianity, the church in and around Rome. Actually, we should say the churches in and around Rome. And another pocket of Christianity is in Carthage, northern Africa. So those are the major pockets of Christianity in the year 100. Estimated, historians are guesstimating that around the year 100, there are about 1,000 Christians in those pockets. From evidence of letters, but if there are 7,000 Christians, you gotta realize, tiny, that is less than 0.01% of the empire's population. Historians guesstimate that around the year 100, there are 60 million people living in the Roman Empire. They got 7,000 Christians. Just tiny pocket. Also, by the year 100, the apostolic age has come to an end, meaning the apostles are all dead. Okay? The beginning years of the church, first 3 decades, the apostles were the leaders, and not just the 12 apostles. Paul considered himself to be an apostle. James considers himself to be an apostle. They're all dead. So now bishops have emerged as the major authorities in the various churches. Around the year 100, there is no New Testament as it later develops. Okay, there's no testament, New Testament. We know that some of Paul's letters have been collected and are circulating together in churches either started by Paul or influenced by Paul. So by the year 100, Paul's letters are being collected together and circulating. We know that there's some overlapping connection between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Scholars are not unanimous in seeing that connection. Some of them are Matthew, Mark, and Luke somehow are using each other. Probably what I think the majority of New Testament scholars believe, and I would agree, Mark wrote first. Mark invented the genre we call gospel. And somehow Matthew and Luke, independently of each other, got a hold of Mark and wrote their gospel. And one reason that makes a lot of sense is what Mark doesn't have. Mark doesn't have any birth narrative. Mark doesn't have an appearance by Jesus raised from the dead. Mark ends with that chapter 16, verse 8. And the women said nothing to no one, afraid was because, that's all. And that will be the gospel lesson this coming Easter. So there's a need. Tell me about Jesus' birth. Well, Matthew and Luke have birth narratives. Matthew and Luke also have resurrection appearances. But this is showing there's some connections that are going on. And John is being circulated independent. Acts is connected and circulated with Luke. So the same person that wrote Luke also wrote Acts. Revelation in the year 100 is only circulating in churches to which it address. Revelation won't be widely acknowledged and accepted as authoritative scripture for another 300 years. Let's see. So let's start with this. In the 200s, we have the first great threatening heresy. It's Gnosticism. Now, the Greek word gnos means knowledge. The understanding is that insiders have received a special secret knowledge that outsiders have not received. So, how do I know Jane is an outsider? Because I got special knowledge and she doesn't. This knowledge provides the key to salvation to only insiders. So Jane doesn't really understand salvation because she's not been given the secret knowledge. The basic theology, there are Christian Gnostics and there are non-Christian Gnostics. But here's the basic theology. All matter is evil. Okay? This chair is evil because it's matter. It's physical. Human beings began as an eternal, non-material spirit. Again, this is both Christian and non-Christian Gnosticism. Human beings began as an eternal, non-material spirit. But now, my eternal spirit is imprisoned in a material body. And that's the result of the material world being created by a fallen spiritual being, often called the demiurge. Okay? So I've got the internal non-material sphere locked up in this material body. By special knowledge, I can get free. So the basic theology for both Christian and non-Christian gospel. Our true spirits are now asleep. They need enlightenment. They need gnosis. They need that secret knowledge for liberating salvation. So when I get the secret knowledge, my eternal spirit will be freed. In Christian Gnosticism, the true messenger who brought that secret knowledge was Christ, not Jesus. Okay? There's a difference between Jesus and Christ in Christian Gnosticism. Jesus was the human material body which the true spiritual Christ inhabited. Jesus' material body died on the cross, but the true spiritual Christ left that body before the crucifixion. So you have Christian Gnostics saying, is God. God is not the creator of the world, because a true God would make physical stuff. So you have a Christian Gnostic saying the creation is bad. Our human bodies are bad. But we get secret knowledge that will free us from this bad body, that will free us from this created earth. So the true God is not the God of the Old Testament, is not the creator God. The true God is just spiritual. And our goal is to get our eternal spirits back to the true God. And let's see, it's 9, that clock's a few minutes slow. So we're going to, next week, we'll pick it up by seeing the first great Christian heretic. It's a guy named Marcion, and he's a Christian Gnostic. So we'll start next week with Marcion and the threat of Gnosticism to Christianity. So thank you.